The clock struck midnight. Brian Cordiva sat motionless in the darkened office, the glow of the monitors casting a sharp light on his hardened face. Painful discoveries from the surveillance system had exposed a double betrayal. The wife he loved and his best friend were his most dangerous enemies. But Brian didn't crumble. He prepared a meticulous plan for revenge that would leave the world stunned. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future stories. The clock struck midnight in the dimly lit office of Brian Cordiva, the visionary behind Sentinel Cybersecurity Solutions. The room was awash with the glow of cascading data streams displayed on an array of monitors. Brian's sharp eyes scanned a log file, his fingers pausing over the keyboard as a flicker of unease crossed his face. The breach was subtle but undeniable. Unauthorized logins linked to Durham Developments, Sentinel's largest client. What unsettled him most wasn't the breach itself, but its origin. Robbie Durham, his childhood best friend and business partner. Brian leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. Threads of suspicion wove together in his mind, forming patterns he desperately wished were false. Robbie's behavior over the past months had been erratic. Delays, missed meetings, and excuses that no longer held weight. Adding to Brian's turmoil was Carissa, his wife. Her recent passages and vague explanations, once dismissed as unimportant, now carried a different connotation in light of this new revelation. Betrayal, the word echoed in his mind, venomous and insistent. A sharp knock at the door broke his reverie. It opened to reveal Antoine Monroe, Sentinel's head of security. Towering and calm, Antoine carried the poise of a seasoned NSA analyst. In his hand was a tablet, its screen illuminated with critical information. "Sir," Antoine began, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "I've traced the login activity. The credentials lead to a personal server Robbie set up, offside. It's not tied to Durham Development's infrastructure." Brian's jaw tightened. Offsite? Why would Robbie bypass his own network? Antoine hesitated before continuing. "I also followed up on that address you flagged, the one Carissa visited last week. It's registered under a shell company, but further digging revealed the lease is in Robbie's name." The revelation struck like a blow, but Brian's expression remained unreadable. Inside his mind whirred, slicing through the chaos with surgical precision. This wasn't just corporate espionage. It was personal. He needed evidence, concrete, undeniable, and incriminating. "Antoine," Brian said, his voice low and commanding, "pull everything on that apartment. Ownership, visitors, activity logs, all of it. Keep this quiet. If Robbie's involved, he's already covering his tracks." Antoine nodded. "Understood. But, sir, this could complicate things. Durham Developments is integral to Sentinel's operations." Brian's gaze hardened. "Then we'll ensure the evidence is airtight. No loose ends." As Antoine left, Brian's phone buzzed on his desk. The name Nadia Moyer, Sentinel's forensic accountant, flashed on the screen. He answered immediately. "Brian, I've found discrepancies in Durham Development's financial reports," Nadia said without preamble. "There are transactions that don't align with their contracts. They're subtle but consistent. Someone's siphoning funds." "Send me everything," Brian ordered, his tone sharp. "I'll handle the rest." The call ended, leaving Brian alone with the pieces of a puzzle he wished he could unsee. The emerging picture hinted at an unbearable truth. His best friend and his wife, entangled in ways he couldn't yet prove but could no longer ignore. The weight of betrayal pressed on him, but Brian wasn't one to succumb to emotion. He had built Sentinel through methodical precision, and he intended to dismantle this web of deceit with the same focus. Pouring himself a drink, he stared out the window at the sprawling city skyline. The amber liquid caught the faint glow of the monitors, a small comfort amidst the chaos. Memories of long nights building Sentinel from the ground up filled his mind. He had faced cutthroat competition and relentless challenges before. This, too, would be a battle, one he refused to lose. Questions gnawed at him. If Carissa was involved, what was her motive? Was she complicit in Robbie's schemes, or was she merely a pawn in a larger game? Each possibility deepened the chasm of doubt, eroding the foundation of trust he once took for granted. Brian turned back to his desk, resolve hardening. Coincidences didn't exist in his world. The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. And tonight, the search would begin. Antoine entered the office with the measured calm of a man accustomed to crises, though an edge in his voice betrayed the gravity of his findings. "I've uncovered some things you'll want to see," he began, his tone steady but urgent. Brian motioned for him to proceed, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Antoine's expression for unspoken truths. Antoine placed a tablet on the desk, its screen aglow with data. Carissa has been regularly visiting an exclusive apartment building for the past 6 months. The building is owned by Robbie, though the ownership is obscured through a web of shell companies. Brian's grip on his pen tightened, his jaw visibly clenched. "How often?" he asked, his voice cold, clipped. "Weekly. Sometimes twice," Antoine replied. He hesitated before adding, "I also checked the fertility clinic records." The appointments were fabricated. She never attended any of them. The revelation hit like a gut punch. The fertility treatments had been a fragile thread holding his marriage together, a shared hope for a future they both pretended was still possible. Now, even that hope was a lie. "There's more," Antoine continued, tapping the tablet to bring up surveillance footage. The grainy video showed Carissa stepping out of a car, her movements confident, deliberate. Moments later, Robbie appeared, greeting her with a familiarity that left little room for doubt. Together, they entered the building and disappeared from view. The weight of betrayal threatened to unmoor Brian, but he forced himself to remain composed. His mind worked furiously, connecting lies and betrayals, dissecting every detail. "What else do you have?" he demanded. Antoine straightened. "The evidence is clear. They've been meeting in private. Whether it's personal, professional, or both, I'll need more time to confirm." Brian's thoughts raced. If this was what it seemed, Robbie and Carissa weren't just betraying him. They were conspiring against him, risking both his personal life and professional legacy. The damage could be catastrophic. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Nadia Moyer, Sentinel's forensic accountant, entered the room, her urgency palpable. She carried a stack of papers, placing them on the desk as she spoke. "Brian, we have a bigger problem," Nadia said, closing the door behind her. "Durham Developments is a fraud. Half their projects don't exist, and the others are wildly overvalued. It's a Ponzi scheme." Brian's chest tightened. "Explain," he said, his voice strained but controlled. Nadia flipped through the papers, pointing to highlighted sections. "Robbie has been using new investor funds to pay off old debts. The returns they've promised are unsustainable. When the money runs out, and it will, the whole operation will collapse." The implications were staggering. Durham Developments wasn't just a major client. It was a cornerstone of Sentinel's operations. Worse still, the fallout would devastate innocent people, including his own family. "My father," Brian said softly, the words heavy with realization. "His retirement fund is tied up in this." Nadia nodded grimly. "They're stealing from your family and countless others. If this becomes public, it won't just destroy Durham. It'll implicate anyone associated with them, including Sentinel." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room, the enormity of the situation pressing down on them. To Brian, the betrayal was deeply personal. Robbie hadn't just risked their business. He had jeopardized the future of the one person Brian had sworn to protect: his father. Brian stood, his movements precise, purposeful. "We can't let this stand," he said, his voice brimming with resolve. "Antoine, step up surveillance on that apartment. I want to know everyone who goes in and out, every conversation, every detail." He turned to Nadia. "Document everything. Build an airtight case against Durham and Robbie. Leave no room for doubt." Nadia hesitated. "Brian, if we go public, the fallout will be immense. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Brian cut in, his tone steely. "This isn't just business anymore. It's personal." The team dispersed, each member intent on their task, leaving Brian alone in his office. He sank into his chair, his mind a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, but most of all, determination. He had built Sentinel from the ground up, sacrificing everything to create something enduring. Robbie had been there every step of the way, a partner and a friend. To discover that trust had been weaponized against him was almost unbearable. And then there was Carissa. The lies, the falsified appointments, the secret meetings. He had prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves. How had he missed this? How had he allowed himself to be so blindsided? But Brian Cordiva wasn't one to dwell on regret. He was a man of action, and if Robbie and Carissa thought they could outmaneuver him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The following morning, Antoine delivered his findings. "Surveillance footage from last night shows Carissa and Robbie meeting again," he reported. "They were there for over 2 hours. I've also found evidence of offshore accounts Robbie's been using to siphon funds. If we trace the money, we'll have solid proof." Brian's lips curved into a grim smile. "Good. Keep digging. I want everything." Nadia entered moments later, her expression tense. "Brian, Robbie's been laundering money through Sentinel's systems. If this leaks, it'll implicate us." Brian's gaze hardened. "Not if we control the narrative. Gather all the evidence. When the time is right, we'll make our move." Over the next few days, Brian worked tirelessly, coordinating his team while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Each discovery tightened the noose around Robbie's neck. The betrayal was a deep wound, but Brian channeled his pain into action. Finally, Antoine handed him a file. "This is it," he said. "Everything we need to take Robbie down." Brian flipped through the pages, the weight of the evidence settling over him. Robbie had betrayed him. Carissa had lied to him. His father's future hung in the balance. But Brian wasn't just a victim. He was a strategist, a survivor. And now, he was ready to strike. The trap was set. Neither Robbie nor Carissa would escape unscathed. Brian Cordiva sat in the dim glow of his home office, the faint hum of the hidden surveillance system punctuating the silence. Monitors before him displayed real-time feeds of Carissa's phone, email, and movements around their home. Installing the high-tech system had been invasive, but it was a necessary step. He was no longer the trusting husband. He was a man preparing for war. For days, Brian observed quietly, piecing together the truth like a master puzzle solver. The affair was no longer a suspicion, it was a confirmed betrayal. Carissa's whispered phone conversations sealed it. Once Brian is out of the picture, Robbie and I will finally have everything. The words replayed in Brian's mind like a poison he couldn't purge. His jaw clenched as he recalled the venom in her voice. They thought they had won, that he was blind to their schemes, but they had underestimated him. The following morning, Antoine entered Brian's office, his expression as grim as the news he carried. "The offshore accounts are active," he began, placing a folder on the desk. "Robbie's laundering money through fake projects and funneling millions out of Durham development. Worse, He's using your father's investment as a front. Brian's eyes scanned the documents quickly. And Carissa? Antoine hesitated. She's fully complicit. Her calls to Robbie confirm she's helping coordinate the cover-up. There's also mention of divorce papers. She plans to use them to consolidate assets. Brian leaned back in his chair, his mind already dissecting their strategy. Divorce wasn't just a personal attack, it was a calculated move. If Carissa married Robbie, they would take control of Durham's remaining assets, leaving his family with nothing. Keep the surveillance running, Brian ordered, his voice sharp. I want every move tracked. They think they're clever, but they don't know who they're dealing with. Antoine nodded, his respect for Brian's composure evident. What's the next step? Brian's eyes hardened. We need allies. It's time to bring in the FBI. 2 days later, Brian sat across from Special Agent Olivia Kane in a sterile meeting room at Sentinel's downtown headquarters. Kane, renowned for dismantling financial crimes, listened intently as Brian laid out the evidence. Her expression remained impassive until she finally spoke. This is solid, Kane said, tapping the folder of documents. Robbie Durham's Ponzi scheme is massive. If this leaks, it will collapse not only his business but any connected entities, including Sentinel. Brian nodded. That's why we need precision. I don't just want to take him down. I want him and Carissa to face consequences without Sentinel becoming collateral damage. Kane smiled slightly. You've thought this through. I don't act on impulse, Brian replied. They're planning an engagement party. It's the perfect opportunity for a sting operation. The days leading up to the event were a blur of preparation. Brian worked closely with the FBI, granting them access to his surveillance systems and meticulously outlining the party's layout. Every detail, from the guest list to the placement of undercover agents, was scrutinized. Meanwhile, Brian maintained a facade of normalcy, playing the role of an oblivious husband while Carissa and Robbie basked in their perceived victory. Late one night, Brian overheard another call between Carissa and Robbie. Her voice was laced with arrogance. Brian won't see it coming, she said. Once the divorce is finalized, we'll use his father's investments to cover the losses. By the time he realizes it, it'll be too late. Brian's grip on the edge of his desk tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Her overconfidence would be her downfall. The engagement party was held at an opulent private estate rented under Robbie's name. Brian arrived early, blending in seamlessly with the guests, his demeanor calm and collected. He exchanged pleasantries, all the while noting the subtle movements of the undercover FBI agents scattered throughout the venue. As the evening progressed, Brian watched Carissa and Robbie. Though they avoided overt displays of affection, their stolen glances and lingering touches didn't escape his notice. A flicker of disgust passed through him, but he pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about emotions. It was about strategy. Antoine approached him discreetly. Agents are in position. Surveillance is live. Brian nodded. Good, let's finish this. The climax of the evening came when Robbie took the stage, a glass of champagne in hand. He addressed the crowd with practiced charm, thanking them for their support and hinting at exciting new ventures on the horizon. Brian listened, his expression neutral, knowing the promises were as hollow as Robbie's integrity. As the applause died down, Brian stepped forward, commanding attention with his presence. The room fell silent as he approached Robbie, extending a hand in what appeared to be a gesture of congratulations. "Robbie," Brian said, his voice steady but loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It's a big night. A shame it won't end the way you planned." Robbie's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" Brian leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Checkmate." At that moment, the doors burst open and FBI agents swarmed the room. The crowd erupted into chaos as agents surrounded Robbie and Carissa, presenting them with arrest warrants. Robbie's confidence crumbled, his face ashen. Carissa turned on Brian, her eyes blazing with fury. "You bastard," she hissed. "You set us up." Brian's expression was ice cold. "No, Carissa, you set yourselves up. I just gave you the stage." As the agents escorted Robbie and Carissa away, Brian stood motionless, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The people who had tried to destroy him were finally facing justice. Later that evening, as the estate emptied and the guests dispersed, Brian stood alone in the garden, the weight of the evening sinking in. Antoine approached, his usual stoic demeanor softened. "It's done," Antoine said. "The FBI has everything they need." Brian nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good. Now we rebuild." Antoine hesitated. "What about your father? The fallout could still affect him." Brian turned, determination burning in his eyes. "I'll protect him, no matter what it takes." With that, Brian walked back into the house, ready to face whatever came next. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished, and Brian Cordiva was a man who never backed down. The grand ballroom buzzed with the subdued chatter of high-profile investors, journalists, and business elites, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was the dawn of a new era for Durham Developments. At the center of it all stood Robbie, exuding charm and confidence as he navigated the room with practiced ease. Carissa lingered nearby, her smile calculated, her gaze sweeping across the crowd with the self-assurance of someone convinced she had won. But the walls were closing in. From the sidelines, Brian Cordiva watched the event unfold, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. This wasn't just another social gathering. It was the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning. Tonight, the truth would come to light, and the carefully constructed facades would crumble. As the lights dimmed, Robbie stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. His voice rang out smooth and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Durham Developments has always stood for innovation, growth, and trust." Brian's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. Trust. The irony of the word was almost comical. Before Robbie could continue, the microphone crackled and the audience turned as Harold Cordiva, Brian's father, approached the podium. His steps were slow but deliberate, his expression grave. "Harold," Robbie called out, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you doing?" Harold raised a hand to silence him and gripped the podium, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I have a confession to make," he began, his tone heavy with guilt. "Durham Developments is a fraud, and I was complicit. For years, I ignored the warning signs, the irregularities, the schemes that kept the money flowing. But tonight, I can't stay silent any longer." Gasps rippled through the audience. Whispers of disbelief turned into murmurs of outrage. Robbie froze, his confident demeanor faltering as panic flashed in his eyes. "What are you doing, Harold?" he hissed, stepping forward. Harold didn't waver. "What I should have done years ago. These people trusted us, Robbie. They trusted you, and you betrayed them." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists scrambled to capture every word, while investors demanded explanations. Robbie's carefully curated image began to crumble, but the night's revelations weren't over yet. Brian stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. He nodded to Antoine, who handed him a tablet. With a few taps, Brian activated the ballroom's massive monitors. The room fell silent as surveillance footage played behind the stage. The videos showed Robbie in clandestine meetings discussing offshore accounts and falsified project documents. Another clip revealed Carissa, her voice dripping with malice as she outlined their scheme. "Once Brian is out of the picture," her recorded voice echoed through the room, Robbie and I will finally have everything. The final blow came when Nadia Moyer, flanked by a team of FBI agents, presented irrefutable evidence, documents detailing the Ponzi scheme, money laundering, and deliberate manipulation of Harold Cordiva's retirement fund. The room erupted again, this time with anger and condemnation. Investors shouted accusations, while reporters bombarded Robbie with questions. The chaos reached its peak as FBI agents moved in, badges flashing. Robbie Durham, an agent, announced, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Robbie staggered back, his charm shattered. "This is a mistake," he protested, desperation coloring his voice. "Harold's lying. This is all a setup." But there was no escape. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, silencing his protests. Amid the pandemonium, Carissa attempted to slip away unnoticed, but Antoine intercepted her near the exit. When Brian approached, her defiance gave way to fury. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice trembling. "Robbie gave me everything you couldn't." Brian's expression remained cold. "Everything I couldn't? Like lies and betrayal?" Her eyes narrowed. "You were too busy with your empire to notice me slipping away. You were nothing more than a stepping stone." Brian's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed measured. "What you failed to realize is that every step you took was recorded." He leaned in, his voice low and cutting. "The game is over, Carissa." Her face paled, but she quickly regained her composure, defiance flaring again. "You think this will make you happy? You think this will give you peace?" Brian stepped back, his gaze steady. "Peace isn't the goal. Justice is." As FBI agents escorted her out, Carissa shot him one final venomous glare, but Brian didn't flinch. He had built his company and life on integrity and discipline, and he wasn't about to let people like Robbie and Carissa destroy it. When the room finally cleared, Antoine approached Brian, his demeanor a mix of respect and relief. "That was intense," he said. Brian exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. It needed to happen. They thought they could outsmart me, that greed and lies would protect them. They were wrong. Antoine nodded. "What's the next step?" Brian glanced around the now empty ballroom, the weight of the night settling over him. "We rebuild. Sentinel will survive this. My father will survive this. And me?" He paused, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'll be just fine." Antoine raised an eyebrow. "And Carissa?" Well, Brian's expression hardened. "She made her choices. Now she'll face the consequences." The night ended quietly. As the last of the guests filed out, Brian stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city lights. The chaos of the evening had passed, but a new challenge lay ahead. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, but he had won a decisive battle. As he gazed at the city he had worked so hard to protect, one question lingered in his mind. What kind of man would he become now that everything had changed? The aftermath of the sting operation sent shockwaves far beyond the gilded walls of the engagement party. The FBI acted swiftly, freezing all assets tied to Durham developments and dismantling Robbie's intricate web of fraud. Headlines dominated the news cycle, telling a story of greed, betrayal, and justice. Investors who had once praised Robbie now cursed his name as his empire collapsed overnight. For Robbie Durham, there was no escape. The charges against him were extensive and the evidence was airtight. At his sentencing, the judge delivered a crushing verdict: 20 years in federal prison without parole. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with effortless confidence now faced decades behind bars. Carissa fared no better. Under mounting legal pressure and with no avenue for escape, she pled guilty to charges of conspiracy and aiding financial fraud. Her lawyers secured a reduced sentence, sparing her the full weight of the law, but ensuring she faced consequences. At her final court appearance, Brian sat in the gallery, watching as her once polished confidence had withered into resignation. He felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of seeing justice prevail. But the fallout was far from over. As investigators delved deeper into Durham developments, they uncovered a shocking twist. Margaret Cordiva, Brian's mother, had been complicit in the fraud. Believing it would protect the family's wealth, she had funneled funds from Harold's retirement savings into Robbie's Ponzi scheme. The revelation reopened wounds Brian thought had begun to heal. When he confronted Margaret in their family home, her response was a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I did it for the family," she said, her voice trembling, "to preserve what we've built." Brian's expression was unyielding. "You didn't do this for me. You did it for yourself, and your greed destroyed everything." Her shoulders slumped under the weight of his words. Margaret was placed under house arrest, confined to the family estate that had once symbolized her success. It was a bitter irony. Her attempts to protect the family legacy had left her trapped in its ruins. Despite the betrayals and chaos, Brian refused to let the darkness define him. Determined to rebuild from the wreckage, he turned his attention to the Durham Guest House, a lavish property Robbie had used to entertain clients and conceal his schemes. Brian transformed the estate into a shelter for victims of financial fraud, naming it Sentinel House. It became a haven for those whose lives had been shattered by greed. Standing in the grand hall of the newly christened shelter, Brian watched as the first families arrived. They were greeted with warmth and support, a promise of a fresh start. For Brian, the transformation of the guest house was more than symbolic. It was a testament to his belief that even in the face of betrayal, justice could pave the way for healing. One evening, as Brian oversaw the shelter's operations, Magdalena, the FBI agent who had led the investigation, joined him. "Your evidence didn't just stop a Ponzi scheme," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "It dismantled an international fraud ring. Robbie's operations were tied to schemes across multiple countries. You didn't just save your company, you saved countless lives." Brian nodded, her words a reminder of the broader impact of his actions. It wasn't just about stopping them, it was about making things right. Magdalena smiled. "Well, you did more than that. You gave people hope." Not everyone saw his actions as noble. Margaret's bitterness lingered, her pride wounded by her downfall. During a rare visit, she confronted Brian, her voice sharp with resentment. "Was it worth it?" she demanded. "Destroying the family legacy?" Brian met her gaze, his tone calm but firm. "You destroyed it, Mother. I only exposed the truth." Her silence spoke volumes, the weight of her guilt finally sinking in. Brian left her there, alone in the home she had tried so desperately to protect, the echoes of her choices haunting the empty halls. That night, as Brian stood on the balcony of Sentinel House, overlooking the city lights, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The journey had been brutal, the betrayals deep, but he had emerged stronger and more resolute. Justice had been served, and the Cordiva name, though tarnished, now stood for something greater than greed. One question lingered in his mind. Would the scars of betrayal ever fully heal, or were they a necessary reminder of the cost of integrity? Brian took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it, not armed with blind trust in others, but with unshakable trust in himself. A decade had passed since the night that changed everything. Brian Cordiva stood in the sleek modern headquarters of Sentinel Cybersecurity Solutions, now a global leader in fraud prevention. From its humble beginnings, the company had grown into a powerhouse, setting the gold standard for detecting and dismantling financial crimes. Sentinel wasn't just a company. It was a mission, a beacon of justice in an age where deception lurked behind every screen. Brian's gaze rested on a wall adorned with accolades, photographs, and heartfelt letters from individuals whose lives Sentinel had helped rebuild. Yet it wasn't the recognition or awards that brought him peace. It was knowing he had transformed his pain into purpose. His foundation, Sentinel Trust, had become a lifeline for fraud victims, offering support, restitution, and the chance to start anew. Across town, Robbie Durham was a shadow of his former self. In prison, his charisma had faded into bitterness, and his confidence had been replaced by hollow resignation. For a man who had thrived on manipulation and power, the isolation of his cell was the cruelest punishment. He had lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, and the illusion that he was invincible. Carissa's story was equally somber. Released from prison after serving her sentence, she led a quiet, unremarkable life. Her once grand ambitions had crumbled under the weight of her choices, leaving her with little more than memories of arrogance and greed. At the Cordiva family estate, Margaret Cordiva found an unexpected path to redemption. After years under house arrest, she began volunteering at Sentinel's Victim Support Center, working alongside those whose pain mirrored the consequences of her actions. Immersed in their stories, she came to understand the depth of her mistakes. Slowly, Margaret worked to rebuild trust, not just with others, but with herself. Though her relationship with Brian remained strained, a quiet understanding grew between them, an acknowledgement of the paths they had taken toward healing. In his personal life, the shadows of betrayal had given way to light. Erica Donovan, a lawyer with her own fierce commitment to justice, had become Brian's partner and anchor. Together, they built a life rooted in trust and shared purpose. Their relationship wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by a steady, enduring love that grew stronger with time. One sunny afternoon, Brian stood in the garden of Sentinel House, watching children play on the lawn. His goddaughter, Justice, approached him, her young face filled with curiosity. "Uncle Brian," she asked, tilting her head, "why do people do bad things?" Brian knelt to her level, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes they think they won't get caught," he said gently. "But in this world, they always do." Justice nodded, her innocent eyes wide with understanding. "Is that why you help people? To catch the bad guys?" Brian smiled. "Not just to catch them, but to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Later that evening, Brian sat alone in his study, a single glass of whiskey resting on the table beside him. The city skyline stretched out before him, a constant reminder of how far he had come. His thoughts drifted to the past, to Robbie, Carissa, and Margaret. Their betrayals had once felt insurmountable, their actions leaving deep scars. But scars, Brian realized, were not just reminders of pain. They were symbols of survival. He picked up a photograph from his desk, a picture of himself with Erica, Harold, and Justice at the opening of Sentinel House. Beneath it, engraved in bold letters, was the motto that had become the heart of his work: "In a world of shadows, justice shines brightest." The lessons of the last decade had shaped Brian into a man who understood the weight of integrity and the cost of betrayal. Justice, he knew, wasn't just about punishment. It was about prevention, about creating a world where greed gave way to conscience. As the night deepened, Brian closed his eyes, letting the stillness settle around him. The journey had been grueling, but it had transformed him. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a protector, a force for change. And as long as deception lingered in the world, Brian Cordiva would remain vigilant, ensuring that truth and justice always prevailed. The digital age had given humanity countless tools, some for creation, others for destruction. For Brian, the choice was clear. Information wasn't just power, it was the ultimate weapon. In the right hands, it could change everything.